The day I handed my fiancé over to my sister, I swore I had destroyed my own life. But I didn't know that the most feared billionaire in the mafia was watching me, and that this act of humiliation would be exactly what made me untouchable. I gave my fiancé to my sister. I said the words like a confession because they deserve no other name. Sacrifice, bargain, betrayal, take whichever feels easiest to swallow. But none of them fits cleanly. I gave him away with my own hands, tied 8 knots in the ribbon of the dress, and watched the man I had promised forever walk down an aisle meant for someone else. People ask how you make that choice. They imagine threats, guns, midnight whispers. The truth is messier, quieter. It smells like old money ledgers, like dust on shelves in a house built for deals and not for the people who lived in it. My father, Carlos, had a mouth full of company names and a stomach full of worry. The factory on the edge of town ran on credit and shame. Our landlord had his solicitor's number on speed dial. There was a board meeting in 2 weeks that would decide whether everything our family had built, what little of it remained, would be sold to cover a single bad bet my father had made, a line of credit he could not pay back. Isabella, my sister, my private thorn, saw that line and leaned on it. She had a way of looking at the world as though it were a ledger to be redistributed. She asked for more than my father could give without losing his pride. She demanded an alliance, not a sated promise. To secure it, she wanted Leonardo. Leonardo was the kind of man who made kindness look like a practical thing. Warm, practical, and honest to a fault. He grew up 2 streets over, learned to fix things that broke, and loved books he could read with his thumb beneath the pages. He had loved me in ways that were soft and complicated. And every time he tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, he made something in me ache with the thought that maybe sacrifice was not what I owed anyone. But love did not pay debts. Love did not save companies, and love certainly did not satisfy the kind of hunger Isabella had. So we made a plan that evening by the back door, with the electricity flickering and my father asleep with the paper folded over his chest. The plan was not clean. It involved timing, dresses identical enough to fool half the church, names spoken aloud where the registry clerk wouldn't notice, and a small, ridiculous superstition about ribbons and vows that my grandmother used to recite. It involved me promising that I would be the one to step back, to let another woman step forward and take the life we had been promised. I told myself I was protecting the family. I told myself I was buying time. On the morning of the wedding, the staged wedding, the genuine one that would belong later to someone else, my hand shook as I fastened the bracelet Leonardo had slipped onto my wrist the first week we were engaged. It was simple. A thin chain, a tiny sapphire set like a held breath. He called it a promise in small letters. He didn't understand how important promises could be in finance and inheritance. He thought they were personal, soft, like the way he hummed under his breath when he fixed a fence in summer. Isabella's dress was folded across a chair in our room. It was my dress, my mother's lace redesigned, a pieced-together memory of a simpler wedding. We had practiced the switch once, in a cruel mirror game earlier that month, so that our faces would have the right tilt, our hands would fall in the right place. We practiced confessions we would never mean to say. I practiced being brave and came up with nothing that sounded like me. The chapel smelled like lilies and something metallic from the organ pipes. There were 2 bouquets, mine with blue roses for impossible wishes, hers with the pale cream of arranged futures. He waited at the altar, Leonardo, smiling as he always did, unaware that name tags can be folded and words can be rerouted. I felt the pull of his hand on mine as our ceremony began, a small, private gravity that made everything else blur at the edges. When Isabella walked in, she wore my veil. When she reached me, she took my hand and, for a heartbeat, squeezed it like an apology. I stepped back and watched the rest as if from a room full of glass. The priest read vows, the people clapped, the wine was spilled. Somewhere between the vows and the kiss, there was confusion. Talking in low, sharp tones, someone noticing a registry mistake, the flutter of a ledger falling out of a bag. Fathers with their jaws set in debt. Mothers with their faces arranged into brittle smiles. The bracelet slipped from my wrist without my feeling it at first. Later, people would say it was a sign. Later, they would tell each other that the broken bracelet on the floor was proof that I had let him go. I remember it as a metallic sound and a small bright cut of blue on the church floor, a tiny comet of glass that caught the light and did not forgive me. You have to understand, in our town, marriage was currency. Wedding alliances determined contracts, construction bids, where money moved after people died. Isabella stepped into the arrangement with a readiness I envied and hated equally. She had chosen her words for the moment she thought there would be no going back. My father signed papers in the vestry with a hand that trembled like a man balancing his last coin on a ledge. Leonardo kissed the bride. He kissed Isabella. And I folded my face into an image of someone who had just completed the most graceful act of disinterested love. They paraded me out as a hero. That was the cruelest part. People clapped. Someone in the congregation touched my elbow and said, "What a noble thing! What a noble lie!" My father put an arm around me and squeezed as though he might bruise me back into gratitude. My mother smiled like we had just been saved. Isabella's lips pressed together in triumph. She slid a silk ribbon into her hair, as if that small detail had cost her nothing. After, the reception was a blur of folded napkins and toasts that tasted like coin. I laughed because that is what I had been taught to do. I smiled because sympathy gathers like moths, and you cannot let them see you bleeding. Leonardo danced with his new bride, and the way he moved was the same gentleness I had loved, and the ease of someone who had been betrayed with all his heart blameless. I watched him and thought of how you can look at someone and not be able to see the guardrails the world builds between you. That night, I went home alone and slept in a room that felt too large, like a coat waiting for a body. I woke to the phone ringing. It was Father's voice, hoarse. There had been an accident. His car, he said. The convoy that had taken them from the reception to the hotel. Someone had rammed them at a junction outside town. Tires flying, glass, a sound like someone tearing fabric. Isabella and the men were fine. They were shaken. They would rest. My father had a fracture in his arm. They were taking him to the municipal hospital. Leonardo had insisted he would stay. He had left with Isabella and everyone else in the fortified set of cars Ricardo had loaned them. Ricardo. His name floated in our lives like a weather pattern we could not predict. He was a man whose fortune moved like a tide. He could buy roads, reinvent neighborhoods, and yet he had a private ferocity that belonged to the kind of people who see threats as chess problems. He had business with my father, partnerships thin as spider silk and promises heavy as anchors. He had also taken a liking to Isabella, or perhaps he took a liking to that which Isabella could produce. Alliances, access, the neatness of a deal closed. He arrived at the hospital like a storm front, dark suit, hands like money. When he touched Isabella's cheek at the emergency entrance, she did not flinch. She smiled like someone offered her a coin, like a lady who knows how to be remunerating. I stood in the corridor and watched them through a glass panel. My father's face was pale and set, the fracture in his arm padded in neat white. He caught my eye and tried to smile. It did not reach his eyes. Isabella sat on a plastic chair and played with the ribbon in her hair, the blue roses in a paper wrapper beside her feet. Leonardo's jaw was raw with annoyance and something else I couldn't name, his humanity on guard. People kept staring at me, as if I had been the one who planned the accident, as if I had been the instruments of all necessary trades. I thought then about the bracelet lying in the dust of the church nave, and how small objects made large proofs in small minds. The days that followed unfolded with a geometry I had not anticipated. Papers arrived at our door with signatures I had never seen. Messages circulated like rumors. Donations, contracts, gifts from Ricardo to my father to help with medical bills. He sent lawyers who smelled of oranges and mint. He sent flowers, the blue roses, always in odd arrangements that looked like winter storms. He sent a message that came as a flat, cold certainty. If you ever need anything, call. What he did not send was an explanation of why he had been at the accident site before the paramedics arrived. He did not explain the men in black coats who accompanied Isabella when she left the hospital, men who watched me every time I stepped out on the street. He did not explain that after the accident, when my father had been moved to a private clinic, a man with Ricardo's crest had come to our house and asked my mother to sign a document that would allow Ricardo's company to oversee the family business until stable management could be installed. I was a bride without a husband, a promise with no currency. I had given Leonardo to Isabella to save my father's company. And instead, the company had been placed under the stewardship of a man who made decisions with the same hands that could crush a grape. The first time Ricardo spoke to me, it was behind the glass of his office. I remember the moment because it felt like standing on the edge of the city and watching a storm decide whether to come in. He had a voice that rolled like credit lines, low and sure. He did not smile. Instead, he appraised me, like someone counting the weight of an object. He knew my name, though he had never invited me to any of the rooms his name opened. "You gave him away," he said without preface. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper. The city skyline slid behind his head in a gray smear. That was brave. I wanted to tell him bravery had nothing to do with it. I wanted to tell him that sometimes you give things away because the alternative is public bankruptcy and your father's humiliation written on the front pages. But the truth came out differently. I did what I thought would protect my family. He listened to this confession with the patience of a man who had listened to many confessions from people who owed him favors. Then he looked at me more closely and said, "Protection is a language. There are different dialects. Some prefer brute force. I prefer arrangements." There were moments when Ricardo's presence felt like protection, and others when it felt like a leash. He offered to have our accounts reviewed by his auditors. He sent a lawyer to the business that convinced my father to sign away controlling shares in exchange for stability measures. My father wept with relief and stood to be helped like a man who has finally been allowed to sit down. My mother folded her hands and pretended to believe that control in the hands of a friend is better than having none at all. For me, the bargain tasted like metal. My sister had married my fiancé, and overnight, I became the family's scapegoat, the woman who had done the decent thing, the one who would be praised for making the hard choice. Only the praise was more like a kind of erasure. People would pat my shoulder, say how noble I was, and the language they used always ended in the future passive tense. She will be cared for. In private, the house hummed with quiet accusations. Isabella now had a role both at the head table and outside it. She sent notes that would thinly veiled apologies, and then withheld them when I needed something real. Leonardo tried to reach me for the first week with messages that read like someone finding his words in the dark. He wrote things like, "I never wanted to hurt you," and "I'm sorry for the way things turned out." He called once and I answered because my throat missed his voice. For a while, we found refuge on the phone like shipwreck survivors sharing a pocket of air. Then things escalated. It started with a note slipped under the door. A single sheet of industrial paper with a single sentence in block letters, 72 hours. No one would tell me what it meant. They acted as if a clock had always been there in the room, counting down to some communal dread. People whispered of vendettas, of old contractor grudges, of the rival family, the Silvas, who had always sought to swallow our business whole and had reasons to be hungry now that our house looked frail. Someone said kidnapping, like the word was an object they could toss against the wall to test its weight. I learned to read the faces of the men who came to our nightly board meetings. They folded their hands like men protecting a temple of glass. Isabella received a parcel at noon and didn't open it in front of us. Later that night, she stood in my mother's garden with the packet unfolded. She read it with a look so carefully arranged, I would have called it theatrical if the idea of theater had not felt so obscene. The note was a photograph, an image cut from something produced by surveillance, and it was of Leonardo walking through a restaurant with a woman whose face was hidden behind a napkin. The paper smelled faintly of petrol. That photograph began the slow corrosion of my temper. Leonardo swore to me that the woman was an old friend from university, that the napkin had been a joke, that nothing had happened. He swore it loudly in the kitchen at midnight with the pots cold beside him. And in the morning, he held the broken blue sapphire between his fingers like a compass that had gone faulty. But the photograph did its work. It made him look guilty in the same way my absence had. It made it easy for people to imagine mistrust, and suspicion is a currency that buys everything when the town needs a villain. I became cleverer at forgiving when the town wanted a narrative. Everything was always at once public and private. Ricardo's men watched the factory. The Silvas made their murmurs. Rumors swelled like river water after rain. And then, as if to punctuate the season, a car belonging to one of our key suppliers burned in the driveway outside a warehouse at 3 in the morning. The blaze was small but symbolic. Whoever lit it wanted a message. No one is untouchable. Our kitchen table became a map of small disasters. Our accountant found irregularities. A shipment disappeared, and with it, a ledger listing clients who had been our last hope. One evening, I found Isabella in my mother's old sewing room, where she kept the boxes of heirlooms and the diary I thought only I read. The diary had been my habit, an old leather-bound book with pages that yellowed like cheese over time. It contained things I never said out loud, my petty victories, my fears, the way Leonardo smelled in the rain. I had written in it as if ink could be prayer. I had always kept the diary tucked beneath a loose board in the back of my wardrobe. When Isabella walked in, she had the same air of someone entering an act. She was holding something between her fingers. My bracelet, the sapphire glinting like a stubborn star. She looked up at me as if I had entered a room where I was not expected. "You should have burned it," she said, and the words were an easy smile. I wanted to snatch the bracelet from her and break every bone in my hand. Instead, I just stood there, the old rage of the wedding still warm in my chest. "How?" I asked. "How did you get it?" She shrugged. "People forget where they leave things. People misplace little pieces of themselves." She placed the bracelet on the table, and it clicked like a small verdict. She ran a finger over the diary and then pushed it toward me. "You really should be careful about what you record," she said. "Words are dangerous." Later that night, alone on the roof while the city breathed under me, I read the diary as if it could tell me the truth about myself. I found an entry I had written 3 weeks before the wedding, when I was still thinking in terms of equations. Day 23, I counted the receipts, thought of the payroll. Day 34, I saw the meeting with Ricardo and I almost felt like a woman with an option. Day 47, if it comes down to choosing between a love that makes me soft and a future that keeps my family housed, what am I worth? The diary felt like a map of my cowardice. It also felt like evidence. That thought made my stomach twist. Evidence is a dangerous thing to keep in a private hand. It can become proof in the wrong head. 2 nights after I found the bracelet, Isabella fainted at a charity gala hosted in one of Ricardo's properties. She collapsed at the head table while they were announcing a new partnership. The rumors spread faster than the port. Her fainting was dramatic. People loved drama. The medics came. Leonardo carried her to the back like a man performing a ritual he did not fully understand. They took her to the same private clinic where my father was recovering from his fracture. I sat in the waiting room with my hands folded and watched Ricardo move through the room as if he owned the light. He did not look at me, but his eyes flicked like a calculation. Later, a nurse would tell me in confidence that Isabella's blood work was odd. Later, another voice would say overwork or stress. The clinic's director said vague things about dehydration. I asked questions and they closed like trapdoors. Someone checked my car in the parking lot. Someone called my house at odd hours to speak in thinly masked threats. I began to understand the shape of the world we had been folded into. A place where enemies use stories and accidents as tools, where the line between legitimate business rivalry and criminal action blurred into a landscape of fear. Then the ransom note came. It arrived as a letter slid under the door at 2 in the morning. My mother found it on her way to the kitchen. The paper was heavy and smelled faintly of the kind of ink old ledger books hold. There was no demand for money, at first. There was a list of names, and then, as if to make sure we understood the stakes, a photograph cut from a surveillance camera of a man I did not know standing across the street from the clinic. The words were simple and pressed. 3 days. 3 days until what? My mother asked, but the faces around our kitchen table already knew. The word hung in the room like a bell. Time was not merely a measurement. It was the currency our enemies were using. They were fine with letting us spend until it ran out. I went to Leonardo that night. He met me in the narrow alley behind the cafe where he kept his bicycle. He was pale. He had not slept. Behind him, the city held its breath like a crowd before a play. "They're setting us up," he said without ceremony. His fists were clenched. "They want to paralyze the company so they can buy it when the price drops. They want to push my father into ruin." "Your father?" I said, because he had always had a way of making everything about the men who had wronged him. He shook his head. "No, your father. They are using Isabella as a wedge." When the words left his lips, it felt like someone had turned a key in a lock I hadn't realized was there. Isabella was a wedge, not an instrument of her own will, but an armature used to tilt the board of our lives. The photograph of the woman with the napkin, the accident, the blue roses, the bracelet on the floor, the diary in the back of a wardrobe, the note under the door. It was all a sequence, a plan, a careful movement through the world as a man plays chess. "Do you think Isabella is in danger?" I asked. He looked at me as if asking the question had already used up what patience he had. "Everything is in danger," he said. "But we can fight. We can—" "How?" I asked. I did not want to be the woman who waited to be saved. The idea of being rescued by anyone felt like a betrayal to my own agency. But the wires were frayed, and I had fingers that shook when they gripped. He took my hand then, not the hand of a man making promises he could not keep, but the hand of a person who had been broken and still wanted to be gentle. "The diary," he said suddenly. "I do," I said. My voice sounded small in the alley. "It's nothing, it's just—" "Bring it to me," he said. "If there is anything in it that can prove what this is, if there's anything that shows motive, timing, coordination, if we can show evidence, we can get people to listen. We can make them fear the consequence of crossing us." Evidence. The same word had been turning like a coin in my thoughts for days. I thought of the pages I had penned like private experiments. I had written names, dates, small observations. I had not meant for them to be useful to anyone but myself. But in a world of threats, even scrap paper could become an anchor. When I brought the diary to him, he read silently while the rain tapped the cafe's awning. I held my breath as if the sound of lungs could be a fuse. He read the page where I listed the dates the creditors had called. He read the passage where I recorded the meeting with Ricardo and my father's trembling hand. He read the line where I had admitted, in small, unforgivable letters, that I had given him away. "It won't be enough on its own," Leonardo said finally. "But it's a start." We were naive enough to think the diary would make the world rearrange itself like dust on a shelf. We did not understand how power prefers to be quiet before it moves, how it likes to gather in circles like vultures. We did not yet see the way the hands in the dark had been watching the diary for a long time. The third day came wrapped in thin fog. There were phone calls with no voices on them, like someone testing a signal. There were flickers of lights in the warehouse district. A man in a suit came to the factory and asked to speak privately with my father about stability measures, while his eyes watched me with the clinical curiosity of someone who studies hospital charts. That evening, Isabella's phone rang. She answered with a laugh that did not reach her eyes. She listened in silence. Then she went very still. "They're here," she said softly, and I felt the word like a drop of acid on the back of my throat. She told us then that someone at the clinic had been moved in the middle of the day under a different name, that a room had been set aside for a private patient, and that someone who suspected, someone who serviced their competitor, had been seen moving near our buildings. The story bled into itself, and the 3 days became urgent, like a countdown. People began arranging guards. Ricardo offered to station some of his men in our neighborhood. He offered more than protection. He offered control. That night, I did something I had sworn never to do. I went to the place I had avoided for weeks, Ricardo's office building, a tower that cut the air with neat edges. I told myself I would ask for nothing, that I would stand and be a woman who had failed and ask for damnation in return. Instead, I found myself with a name on my tongue: protection. I wanted him to make them stop, to put his weight behind us so the Silvas would think twice before they burned our warehouses or our reputations. I had imagined him as a man who would simply smile and do what needed doing. Instead, when I told him the story, he listened and his face did not shift. He poured a thick black coffee and watched me with an expression that made a child of my resolve. "You wish for protection, Miss Duarte," he said. He did not call me by the pet name my family used. Protection requires exchange. There was always an exchange. It was late when I left his office, the city like a smudged photograph behind me. I carried with me the sense of a machine being oiled, some great apparatus stirring into motion. I also carried the knowledge that to accept his hand would be to make myself fit to his patterns. Untouchable, he had promised at the hospital earlier. Untouchable in the social sense, shielded by his reach. Not above consequence, never that, but shielded from the street-level cruelties that had begun to circle our family like dogs sniffing out vulnerability. As the fog lifted and the city settled like a beast whose breath had calmed, I understood the hazard of entering his orbit. He was safety with thorns. He was a savior who might one day become a jailer. To accept was to exchange one kind of powerlessness for another. To refuse was to let the house we had lived in crumble. I slept badly that night, pressed between memory and the possibility of a new script. The diary lay on the table by the door like a map that might lead to freedom. The bracelet, with its tiny blue star, sat in a jewelry dish like an accusation. When dawn came, a courier arrived with a photograph laid across his palm. An image that had been taken of Leonardo leaving a side door of the clinic at 2 in the morning. He was not alone. He held a small paper bag. The face behind him was obscured. On the back of the photograph, a sentence had been written in a neat, indifferent hand. "Proof will open doors." The room seemed to tilt with that line. Proof, I realized, was not neutral. Proof is a tool. Proof can be given, sold, or used to lock someone into a narrative that will not let them go. We had been given proof about Leonardo. Perhaps someone had proof against us. There was a knock at the door then. My mother answered with hands that shook. The visitor was one of Ricardo's men, a man who smelled of rain and expense. He handed her an envelope, and inside was a single bracelet clasped on a napkin. The sapphire bracelet, the one that had fallen in the church. It had been polished and placed with the kind of care that made it look like evidence preserved. My mother looked at me and then at the bracelet as if it had been a letter from a dead relative. "They brought this," she whispered, and her voice was full of wonder and dread. "From the people who found it." At that moment, I felt the world contract to the size of a room, and the edges fray like torn receipts. The bracelet had traveled somewhere I did not know. Somebody had found it. Somebody had preserved it like a relic. I had thought the pieces would make a straight line. Diary, bracelet, photograph, evidence. But the line was crooked. Someone else was placing pieces on the board with a hand I had yet to see clearly. That afternoon, I found a page in the diary I had not known existed. It was a short entry, a notation in the margin about the 909 steps. I had written it during the summer when my father and I had gone to the old estate at the river, the place where he had grown up. There was a narrow path that led to a stone pier, and down along the bank, a stairway that the locals called the 909 steps, though no one had counted them in years. It was a joke in the town, an exaggeration to make the walk seem longer, and therefore the return more grand. I had written, half in jest, 909 steps, enough time to decide whether to step or retreat. I had meant it as a metaphor for resolving something by walking it off. Now the phrase bounced in my head like a knell. 999, steps, chord, an oddness. I was beginning to suspect that even our folklore could be turned into proof or into puzzle pieces that would make threats feel inevitable. That night, as the city dimmed and the rain began again in a thin, patient drizzle, the phone rang. The voice at the other end was distorted, as if spoken through a pipe. It spoke one sentence and then cut off. If you sign, they go bankrupt. If you don't, she dies. The line went dead, like someone slamming a door. I sat with the receiver in my hand and looked at the diary, the bracelet, the photograph. They were no longer artifacts of my past, but levers in a machine that wanted us broken. I had given my fiancé to my sister in order to save what little dignity and what vague inheritance we had left. In doing so, I had stepped into a new arrangement, one that required me to choose again, between my family and the larger world of power that had just opened its hands to me. Ricardo's offer was the shadow at the edges of my life. He could make me untouchable, he had said. But to be untouchable by others is also to become touchable only by someone else. To accept his kind of protection would be to owe a debt I could not yet name. And yet, in that sliver of night, with the rain making slow music on the roof, I realized I had been making bargains my entire life. Bargains with silence, with survival, with the way people expected daughters to be. The next bargain would be the largest. It would decide whether we would be bought and rebuilt or dismantled entirely. I wrote the date across a fresh page in the diary, an act halfway between defiance and a plea. Then, with hands that were not steady, I wrapped the bracelet in tissue and placed it back in its dish. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, where a car passed and the shadow of a man lingered just long enough to be noticed. The town was a seam of light between one misfortune and another. Somewhere between the doorstep and the phone line, someone had decided they needed to make us hurt. The choice in front of me was not only about who to protect, but about what kind of person I wanted to be when all was said and done. I had given Leonardo away to save a failing name. I had made myself the shield. Now I had to decide whether to become someone's untouchable, fortified by wealth but possibly imprisoned by it, or to find a way through this with my hands clean enough to wake at dawn without feeling like a thief. Either way, I was beginning to understand the shape of the cost. Stick around, the ending will flip everything you think you know. I told him no at first. I sat across from Ricardo in the same high-rise that had felt like a foreign country the night before, and I tried to find a way to refuse without burning the house down. He watched me as if measuring how much of me would fit in his palm. He did not raise his voice. He never did. That was the most dangerous thing about him. His calm felt like an instruction. If I accept, I said, what exactly do you want in return? He steepled his fingers, and the skyline slid across his face like ledger lines. Stability, he said. Presence, a name attached to a legacy, and protection, of course. There it was, presence. A place on a roster, a line in a shareholder list, a signature that would make creditors think twice. He offered me a bundle of legal constructs dressed up as safety, a trust, an irrevocable appointment to a small board, an open letter to the press that would position me as an ally of his house. He promised the lawyers would be his, the auditors would be his, the investigators would be his. He promised the Silvas would feel his attention, and not in a way that involved street violence, but in a way that would suffocate their deals and make banks pull loans. What does that mean for me? I asked. Will I have to— You will be untouchable in the marketplace, he interrupted, precise. Not above the law, not immune to consequence. But when creditors call, they will think twice. When your sister's enemies move, they will feel an immediate friction. You will no longer be the soft center people aim at for leverage. You will be a public interest tied to me. It felt like being offered armor that had a label stitched into the lining. Property. You'll be attached to me, I said. He made no protest. And you will be attached to protection. We can draft terms that grant you independence in your name, but there are costs. There are always costs. I thought about the diary, my confession book, folded like a map of my own weaknesses, and the bracelet that had ended up elsewhere like a marker someone else had left behind. I thought about the photograph with the napkin and the tiny fuel smell of a frame set for burning. I thought about 3 days and 12 hours, about notes slipped under doors, and about men with clinical eyes. I need to know if you can get Isabella back, I said. That made him pause in a way his kind rarely did. He folded his mouth for a second as if considering whether to allow me to call the woman his interest had favored Isabella in the same breath as your family. We can retrieve her, he said at last. But retrieval is different from rescue. There are reputations to be considered, deals to be brokered, proofs to be manufactured or destroyed. I do not do stunts that embarrass me in public. I work in leverage. She's being used, I said. She was. She's part of the plan. She is the wedge. He nodded, slow. Often the wedge is also a willing blade. But if you want my help, Miss Duarte, you will sign preliminary documents acknowledging that I will oversee certain measures, legal, financial, PR. You will also allow me access, limited, to the diary, and you will allow me to choose public actions. My throat closed. Letting him read my diary felt like inviting a stranger to sit in my skin while I slept. But I had written things in that book no one else knew. Places, dates, the tremor in my father's hand as he signed away control. If he could parse those into a narrative that exposed the Silvas and the men who pulled strings, if he could use what I had been ashamed of to save the thing I had loved, then perhaps the bargain would be worth the wait. I signed the preliminary papers because the night had a way of shrinking the alternatives. If I refused, I could imagine the Silvas buying our debt, moving quietly and extracting the factory until nothing remained but a foundation stone and a grief. If I agreed, I had to become visible in a way that made me dependent on a man I already suspected I would fear. The strategy he offered was as elegant as it was cold. He would freeze small assets linked to the Silvas through legal maneuvers predicated on evidence of laundering and improper collusion. He would leak certain files to journalists who owed him favors. He would loan our company a line of credit in his name, structured so that the board could vote to hand operational control to me temporarily, on paper, for stability reasons. He would place his own audit team in our accounts and, crucially, would stage a managed exposure of the photos and documents that proved Isabella had been approached and compromised. The resulting panic among the Silvas' lenders would force them into a defensive negotiation. In exchange, I would sit at a table he would name, I would sit in the press photos he wanted, and I would let him hold the diary briefly while his investigator verified its contents. The diary would be photostated and verified, and those verifications would become the seed of legitimate legal filings. When I left his office, the city felt smaller, as if someone had folded up the skyline and tucked it into a pocket. I carried the consent papers like a stone in my stomach. The ride home was a slow reel of grief and calculation. They moved fast after that. Ricardo's lawyers arrived at dawn. They combed through the factory's books in a way my father had never permitted, like men dismantling a clock to see how the second hand had been stolen. They found small irregularities and seeds of corruption that, when placed under a certain light, looked like strategic holes cut into a ship's hull. They found a trail of payments that led to shadow companies with names the banks did not know and the Silvas loved. Ricardo smiled once when they produced a ledger with a barely legible ink entry from 6 months before. An entry that pointed to a transfer that, in the hands of banks, would be interpreted as deliberate misdirection. The public leak came 3 days later. An anonymous journalist, one who owed Ricardo favors and a quiet lot of loyalty, printed a piece about undisclosed collusion between the Silvas and a supplier that had worked on several municipal contracts. The article was factual, meticulous. It read like research, not slander. Within 48 hours, the Silvas' main lender froze certain lines of credit pending investigation. The pressure began to make a sound. Meanwhile, Ricardo's men staged a rescue operation of sorts. Not a cinematic raid, but a quiet negotiation through channels the police would have found clumsy to untangle. An intermediary, someone who smelled of the sea and the kind of men who wear heavy watches, delivered footage to one of Ricardo's captains. The footage showed a small, rented room where Isabella had been kept, watched, fed, and interrogated. She looked tired but alive. The intermediary had pulled strings, traded favors, and used leverage Ricardo had tucked into a drawer. Within hours, Isabella was released to a neutral care facility and whisked under a different name to recuperate. She arrived at our house 2 days later with a face that had been scrubbed of triumph and a voice that had been muted. She wanted to see me. That request alone made my stomach drop. When she came into the room where my mother kept the old portraits, she looked at me the way someone inspects an object they might have stolen. There was no apology in her posture. There was only a tired, brittle person who had survived something, and who knew now that survival could be converted into power. "You made her untouchable," Isabella said to me quietly, as if counting the syllables. "You made yourself untouchable." The line landed like a challenge. I did not answer. I had trade-offs written on my wrists. I had papers signed. I had a legal structure that made our competition think twice before moving. Isabella sat down and folded her hands. Her eyes flicked to a small bouquet on the table. Blue roses, Ricardo's signature delivery. "They took me," she said. "They wanted leverage. They wanted to make my life a currency. We were a market." "Who?" I asked. "The Silvas?" She laughed then, short and shocked. "Everyone," she said. "People we thought friends, contractors, a broker who wanted a new contract, someone in the clinic who was not who they said they were. They moved me like I was a letter they could fold." "And you?" "And me?" I asked. "You gave them a reason," she said. "You gave them an opening." Her words were accurate in a way that made me nauseous. But she did not stop there. She leaned closer, and the air smelled of hospital disinfectant. "They thought if they exposed you, if they built you into a figure of pity, people would cancel your protection," she admitted. "They thought they could get at Ricardo's edges through you. They misread what he did." "You had nothing to do with it," I said. "You were a victim." She tilted her head. "So were you. But we weren't the same kind of victim. You pretended it was noble, and they took that and turned it into a lever. We circled each other like two animals remarking on the shape of a cage. The house had begun to hum with different kinds of attention. Men in suits came by more often and smiled at my father with the practiced interest of vultures. The boardroom had a new deputy from Ricardo's firm in it, a conciliatory presence who suggested small phrases like governance and stability to the older men. Outside, the town watched. People like simple narratives. They would choose heroes and villains because indecision is heavy and stories are light. The press articles juxtaposing the Silva's alleged illegalities with our supposed heroism were effective. People began to talk about the young woman who sacrificed love to save a town. The line made me want to vomit. Then the phone rang again. The voice was the same as before, paper thin and hollow. "You are on a timetable," it said. "We want an agreement." It was not the Silva's voice. It was someone smarter, someone who understood that a town could be steered by its whispers. They wanted signatures. They wanted guarantees. The paper they slid under our door in the night smelled of ink and old coin. There were numbers in it. There were threats. There was a photograph of Isabella, alive but blinkered. "You signed with him," the voice said. "You handed them to new hands." "I won't sign anything that harms anyone," I said, my fingers shaking. "They don't care," the voice said. "But if you want to keep her alive, you'll do what we say." The choice was being made with a knife I could not see. I tried the police. I tried to hand everything to officers who said the words kidnapping and then took 3 days to write a report. The legal system moved slowly, and our enemies were patient. They could allow a company to shrink to the point of desperation while a family waits in the wings hoping someone will come. Ricardo moved faster. He called me into a meeting and placed 2 items on the table: a small envelope with a business card and a piece of paper with a single sentence written across it in tight, businesslike handwriting. "If you sign, they live. If you don't, they die." He looked at me with the look of a man who had measured the world and decided I could be trusted to barter in extremes. "We can arrange a transfer of assets," he said. "You sign documents that authorize me to manage certain creditors, and you grant me the power to exercise a fiduciary hold. In return, I will secure Isabella's release." I thought of Leonardo in the alley behind the cafe, of his hands and the way he had held the diary like a treasure. I thought of the small cobalt gem sliding across the church floor, of my father's face as if someone had borrowed emotion and forgot to return it. I thought of the 999 steps and the idea that time itself had been turned into a rope we were supposed to climb or be strangled by. "I will not bargain your life," I whispered. "Then we will be forced to choose between force and law," Ricardo said. "I will attempt to buy time with banks, but they will require signatures. They need someone with skin in the game to justify holding assets." The meeting ended without a resolution. The paper sat in my bag like a stone. The night before the deadline, I went to the pier where the 990 steps met the water. The path down was slick with condensation. I had never counted the steps. It had always been rhetorical, a way to exaggerate the length of a walk. But that night, I went down. Every step an attempt to order my breathing. Perhaps the sea would answer a question. Perhaps the thin, anonymous waves would be less judgmental. At the bottom, the pier smelled of algae and the kind of loneliness that is not dramatic, just a consistent ache. I sat, and Leonardo came up behind me as if he had been a shadow I had always known. "He called me," he said without preface. "Ricardo. He said he would help. He wants you to sign." "I don't want to be indebted to someone like that," I said. "What kind of protection chains you to someone else?" "He says he can make them stop," Leonardo said. "He says he can make the papers everyone is afraid of exist in a way that even the banks will accept. If he does, Isabella will be safe." I turned to him. He was worn in a way that made me ache for a life we couldn't have. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Don't ask me that," I answered. "You're the one who was taken." He smiled, but it was a fragile thing. "You gave me to your sister," he said, "not because you wanted to."
Because you thought it would stop a house from falling. You didn't ask me if I wanted to be a conductor of forgiveness. There were things between us that had been unsaid and now glared like exposed wiring. He had his loyalties tied in knots. He had his own life interrupted by someone else's design. But when he took my hand on that pier, it was without ceremony or promise. It was the simple kindness of a person who remembered what we had been. "Whatever you do," he said, "do it carefully. The rope they're offering is not always a lifeline." The next morning, the papers were ready. Ricardo's legal team presented a structure, a trustee agreement, a temporary assumption of operational oversight, an irrevocable power of attorney limited to corporate governance for the duration of an emergency. The documents were dense and precise. They folded into themselves like origami representing debt. In plain language, it meant I would be the public face of an arrangement Ricardo would effectively control. And in return, he would use his machine to pull strings and expose the people trying to destroy us. I signed. Signing felt like stepping into a room and closing the door behind me forever. It felt like putting on a dress that fit properly, even though it pinched at the right places. It felt like survival. And survival is an innately selfish act, even when it is cloaked as sacrifice. The moment the signature dried, the machine began to turn. Ricardo's team produced files, bank transfers, shell companies, small pesticides of corruption that, when lined up like dominoes, revealed a pattern. He printed them and fed them to journalists who had been waiting in the wings. Attorneys served cease and desist letters that carried the weight of men who had been in the game long enough to make their threats believable. His auditors placed a discreet hold on certain accounts connected to the Silvas. The public narrative shifted. The Silvas panicked. They made public statements, denial after denial. They hired their own expensive lawyers and set up counter-narratives about vendettas and smear campaigns. They blamed Ricardo for trying to take their companies. The men who had been whispering to our creditors found their whispers returns like cold air. And in the middle of this legal ballet, Isabella was returned to us. She came back with a face lined by something heavier than illness, by the knowledge that her life had been used as a bargaining chip. She emerged a quiet person. People who had once applauded my supposed nobility now eyed me with a new kind of curiosity, an interest that smelled of caution. When the press came to the house, Ricardo's name was mentioned in the way one mentions a benefactor. Interviews were arranged. Photographs were taken of me in dresses that were both modest and impossible. I agreed to appear in a small, framed piece about resilient daughters saving family legacies. It felt grotesque and necessary. The final move came like a set piece in a chess match. Ricardo's investigators found a ledger, an off-label scanned sheet from a municipal account that had been redirected through a company with a name like a taxidermist. The ledger contained transfers that matched the time frames when certain contracts with the Silvas had been granted. It was not proof beyond doubt, but it was enough when fed to the right bank to make them freeze lines. Within a week, the Silva suppliers called in late payments, and the Silvas were forced to default on several contracts. They lunged to save themselves. They made a deal with a friend in the municipal government who tried to apply pressure on the police to drop lines of inquiry. But their allies had been scrubbed clean by the same machine Ricardo had oiled into motion. One by one, the smaller shields fell away. They were forced into negotiation. At a public hearing that by construction drew cameras and lawyers, the Silvas were accused of impropriety. They defended themselves with the language of denial and wounded honor. The town watched like an audience at a courthouse drama. The cameras lingered on my face because I had become the human element in a legal ballet, one meant to demonstrate that power had chinks. Isabella testified, and what she said surprised everyone. She told the truth, but in doing so, she rewired the narrative.
She spoke of pressure, of being watched, of being manipulated into taking certain calls. She admitted to fear and to the way she had allowed herself to be bought by the promise of security. She named names in a way that was careful but damning. She could have continued to lie. She chose not to. Was it courage or survival? Maybe both. Maybe it was an attempt to salvage something of herself by telling the truth. Whatever it was, the consequence was public shaming for the Silvas and a cascade of legal reprisals. Banks called in loans. Contractors refused to work with their firms. The Silvas watched as a tower they had built with unseen hands began to crumble because the foundations were made of bad faith. The final humiliation for the rival house came with a quiet legal seizure of a few key assets, an arrangement Ricardo had negotiated with a court that relies on evidence and elegant pressure. Their main operational temperature fell, and their company began to shrink under the weight of frozen accounts. We had won, in a way. But victory smelt odd. It smelt less like triumph than like unattended burning. There was a cost ledger that showed the price. People who had lost jobs because the Silvas' contracts failed swore at our windows. Workers at the factory had been paid, but watched their future contributions thin as the company adjusted. Our little town had a new unemployment notice posted outside the municipal center, and people came to our door with demands and whispers. Power shifts create casualties. And then, a new complication, the diary.
Ricardo's investigator had copied the diary. He had verified handwriting, dates, and contexts. In the hands of the right lawyer, it was a private memorandum that helped stitch together the sequence of events, proving collusion. But then something else happened. Someone posted photocopies of selected diary pages online. Selective editing makes narrative choices, and the segment posted included an excerpt where I had written, ironically, about giving Leonardo away. The snippet was framed with a headline that made me sound manipulative and cold. The internet is a place where nuance is a smudge. People saw only what fit their appetite. A woman who had given her fiancé away, arranged a wedding deception, and then used those deeds to manipulate a town. Trolls called me calculating. Commenters questioned whether my sacrifice had ever been noble or just theatrical. It was a small thing in the scheme of a legal victory, but in the court of public sentiment, small things matter. Isabella took to avoiding mirrors for a week. She sat with a face like a woman who was learning the shape of shame. Leonardo came to see me, and his eyes carried an ache that made me wish I could sew our lives back together with the blue thread of the bridal ribbon. "You did what you thought would save your family," he said quietly. "You saved your name. You saved the company, maybe. But in the process, you moved into a world that is not kind to people who want to be private." I wanted to tell him that being untouchable had a poetic side, an image that feeds itself on the idea of invincibility. But there was no poetry in the way creditors cough and politicians swallow. "Do you hate me?" I asked. He shook his head. "I hate that you had to choose," he answered. "I hate that the world makes women choose between different sorts of death." Our relationship rewired itself into something less romantic than practical. We exchanged hours, not promises. We shared coffee at odd times, and when we met in public, our hands brushed like old instruments we no longer used correctly. It was both comfort and havoc. And then a singular blow. A doctor called me with the wrong kind of urgency. He spoke softly, as if the news were fragile porcelain. "Miss Duarte," he said, "we need to see you. Miss Isabella, there's a pregnancy." My world rearranged. For a ridiculous second, I thought the call concerned someone else entirely. Then the reality folded back as if someone had pulled a curtain. Pregnancy had been the last variable I had not wanted in the equation. It changes things in an instant. It becomes a reason for people to care more or to exploit more. It is a story that can be used to manipulate reputations, to secure heirs, to produce leverage. Isabella's pregnancy, if she announced it, would complicate everything. It would force the board to consider family line and succession, to think in terms of lineage rather than balance sheets. It could make her unassailable in some quarters. It could make her the most vulnerable in others. She told us the news in a parlor that smelled of lemon. It landed like a grenade wrapped in silk. My mother cried at the news, not because she felt joy, but because it knitted into the terrible arithmetic of inheritance. This child, my mother said, might be what ensures a future. I saw then how the world keeps circling back to the same pivot, lineage. People who care about family businesses care more about bloodlines than about working factories. The pregnancy reframed everything as something of potential royalty. But then the photograph surfaced. It was a small video clip, grainy and shot from a security camera. It showed a room in the clinic with a woman, Isabella, sitting on a bed in a private room. It showed a man moving boxes. It showed, briefly, a hand that slipped an envelope under the pillow. The footage was not definitive proof of tampering, but when matched to ledger entries and the diary's dates, it made the coincidences impossible to ignore. Ricardo decided it was time for a decisive public move. He held the press conference. He stood to my left and kept his face blank and patient while one of his lawyers presented evidence that connected the Silvas with intermediaries suspected of coercion and bribery. Then Ricardo spoke, and his voice was the sound of someone who knows how to lower a room. "We have protected our community from predatory forces," he said. "We have ensured that those who attempted to weaponize families and businesses for personal gain will face the law. We are not a law unto ourselves, but where the law lags, we will cooperate to bring evidence forward." The cameras flashed. People whispered. The legal moves forced an investigation that, while taking months to sort through, immediately shifted pressure. The Silvas were no longer a house of safe deals. Their suppliers called in debts. Council members who had been friendly to them began to step back. Isabella's story was complicated. She testified in front of an investigator that she had been coerced, that her fainting had been a panic attack triggered by threats, that the envelope found in her room had been placed there by someone not identified in the clip. She did not want to be a spectacle, but she also wanted the nightmare to stop. We were all tired. The pressure broke them. The Silva's assets were put into temporary receivership pending investigation. Contracts were renegotiated. The man who had once sat across a table from my father and smiled like conspiracy was suddenly calling us with desperate pleas. He offered things he could not really give to a family who had already taken more than had been theirs. There was a public cost. Men at the factory muttered that they had been collateral. People who had supported the rival family now found themselves without income. Sometimes the consequences of justice are not tidy. In the lull after the public maelstrom, Ricardo approached me privately. He placed a small envelope in front of me that contained a deed, a trust instrument naming me as the beneficiary of a percentage of our company, controlled by a third-party trustee, but with clear safeguards that isolated that portion from seizure in the event of further attacks. It was a practical arrangement, a way to ensure that my name was legally tied to assets that would allow me to run the business autonomously enough to put workers on payroll without my father being in the direct line of fire. "You will be untouchable now," he said, matter-of-factly, in business terms. My fingers trembled as I opened the paper. It was a promise, but as all promises by men like Ricardo are, it was also a contract. He would not be anonymous anymore in my life. His name would be connected to mine in public documents, letters, and the occasional photograph. He had given protection, and the gift came with strings. "Why me?" I asked. He looked at me like someone who had once been offered a favor and refused. "Because you made the hard choice," he said. "Because you were visible, and visibility matters.
Because I prefer to keep my assets in people who understand the cost of sacrifice. There it was, the truth that hurts. He admired my capacity to pay a price. He had no illusions about whether I loved him or the value of my guts. He saw in me someone who could be polished into a brand, a philanthropic image fused with vulnerability and strength. I accepted the deed. I walked away with legal weight on my shoulders and the metallic taste of a bargain in my mouth. Leonardo was there when I told him. He held my hands and did not lecture me. He only said, "You did what you thought was right." We were not heroes. We were survivors. We had scabbed our wounds and moved on. But being untouchable had further implications. It meant that when gossipers and rivals pointed their fingers, they now pointed at a woman protected by a man who owned roads. They could not touch me without touching him, and people feared touching him. He had the means to make trouble expensive. The final act that sealed our new world was less a gunfight than a series of signatures in sterile rooms. The trustship was formalized, the shares were reallocated. Banks accepted the new structure because Ricardo's name carried weight firms do not like to contest. The Silvas found themselves under investigation, their assets frozen, their power curtailed. In the wake of it all, Isabella left town for a while. She took the pregnancy and retreated to a center where she could be safe until the child was born. She wrote letters, terse and infrequent. Sometimes they contained apologies. Sometimes they contained barbed observations about the way families bleed their own. She did not know, and perhaps never fully forgave herself for both a victim and an actor in the story. Leonardo left too, for a season. He took a job in another county fixing things. He sent postcards with small sketches of coastlines. We wrote each other in a way that newer lovers do, not daily, but with the sort of restraint that keeps tenderness from turning into a tragedy. He wanted to heal in a place where the town could not sting him. As for me, the trust's legal protections allowed me to hire managers at the factory, to put wages back on schedule, and to initiate small contracts that would keep families fed. People who had lost jobs because of the Silva's contracts were eventually rehired under new agreements. The town did not forget the costs, but it also began to move forward because survival demands a kind of forgetting that is not cruelty but muscle. Then the quietest blow arrived, unceremonious and intimate. One afternoon while I was in the office, a courier delivered a small parcel addressed to me. Inside was a small, battered book, a child's book with a cover that had blue roses on it. Tucked inside was a note in Isabella's hand. "I'm sorry," it read. "I am so sorry. I wish this had been different. The child will be protected. I hope you find a way to forgive me someday." I folded the note and pressed it to my chest. The thought of the child, another life caught in the tangle we had made my breath stop. The future, the one we had been fighting to save, was now literal and fragile in the shape of a bow on a small book. The town adjusted to the new order. Ricardo's name appeared in print more often, with references to philanthropy and conservatorship. People who had once feared him began to accept his sponsorships, a new grammar of power. He started projects to rebuild what had been broken by the Silva's misdeeds. In public, he was generous. In private, he remained selective, his favors parceled like currency. I met him once, in a small room with low lights, to discuss a donation for the factory scholarship fund. We spoke of nuts and bolts and worker training. He complimented my management plans with the patience of a mentor. "You are untouchable now," he said later, without malice. "People will not come for you for petty reasons anymore." I thought about the word, untouchable. It was a shelter, and it was a cage. "What happens when they need you to do something you don't want?" I asked quietly. He smiled, not unkindly. "Then you will be faced with a choice again." He didn't mean the immediate choice. He meant the constant one, to trade pieces of oneself for survival, again and again. To accept a patronage that kept you safe in exchange for obligations you would rather not owe.
I left the meeting feeling both safer and poorer. There are afternoons now when I sit in the back of the factory and watch the women who fold components at a line and imagine their lives continuing in small increments. There is a satisfaction to the practical. Wages paid, rust removed, machines humming. There is a horror to the moral. How much of oneself to surrender? How much to keep?
Sometimes I walk the pier and count steps I never counted before. The myth of 999 steps still sounds like a scandalous exaggeration. In reality, it is only a long descent, and there is a time when you must stop going down and begin to climb. The cord of my choices is both rope and tether. I think about Leonardo often. We are not lovers in the way we once thought possible. We are an archive of what could have been. He writes occasionally and tells me stories of small towns where people value fixing things over making fortunes. He is rebuilding himself in quiet, honest ways. When he came back one evening to the town, just to see, he looked at me across the market square and smiled a tired, generous smile. We nodded. There was no scene of dramatic reconciliation. There was a private handshake between two people who had survived different violences. I think about Isabella, moving her body and a life inside her through the world like a brittle object she is trying to protect. I think about the child she will bring into a family with a complicated ledger. I hope for that child in a way I hope for no other's children, that they will not have to pay for adults' mistakes with their futures. And I think about Ricardo, whose protection is a grid that can be used to keep wolves away, but also used to steer the herd. He is not a villain in the cartoonish sense. He is a man who makes hard, sometimes cruel, sometimes salutary choices. He has made my name a shield. He has also made me his public project. There is power, real, measurable, that flows through that relationship. There is also a cost I feel in my ribs like a slow bruise. Once, not long after the trusts were set and the Silva's assets were under investigation, a man from the rival family came to my home. He had a face that was both small and frightened. He left a single item at our doorstep, a photograph of the church floor the day of the wedding, the blue sapphire glinting like a comet. Someone in his circle had found it in a pawn shop and thought to return it. The bracelet had gone a long way, through hands and pockets, across tables and nights. It had been polished and placed on napkins and used as evidence in negotiations. It was now back in my home, tarnished at the edges but intact. I picked it up and held it like a relic I hadn't wanted to keep. I thought of Leonardo's small hands, of my father's trembling in the vestry, of the priest's words that had sounded like a promise, and the ledger that sounded like a sentence. I thought about how things can travel and be reshaped into truths that suit someone else. Wearing that bracelet now, after all the deals and signatures, makes me feel strange. It is a token of a promise that was made in a different life. It is a proof of love and a symbol of a bargain. It is a small thing that contains an entire history. The final reckoning did not come in court or on a battlefield. It came in a simple public statement Ricardo arranged when the Silvas were finally forced to liquidate certain operations. He read a short note about community and the responsibility of leadership. And then, with a look toward our home, he announced a donation for a small workers' fund. Cameras flashed. The town applauded. The men who had once whispered now had to build other alliances. In the weeks after that, life began to arrange itself into patterns I can live with. The factory had stability. My father slept without nightmares in a way that seemed honest. My mother started to garden again. People who had been unemployed were rehired. Isabella sent pictures of the baby, blue roses, small socks, a tiny book with illustrations. She wrote, "He is beautiful, he is loud, and loud means alive." She sent love like a string of fragmented apologies. I went to the market sometimes and watched people who had once looked at me like an object of pity now offer me small smiles of respect.
They did not know the legal machinations behind the scenes. They only knew the result. Food on the table, steady wages, a business that did not collapse overnight. At night, I lie in bed and think about the bargains we make. I think about how everyday life is an accumulation of small and large compromises. I think about the phrase he used, untouchable, and how it is both a refuge and a prison. I think of the day I fastened that bracelet around my wrist and the day I watched it fall and glitter like a comet on the church floor. I think about the press articles that called my choice noble and the trolls that called it manipulative. I think about the child who will inherit a name she did not choose. If I had to tell you the truth about what it is like to be untouchable, I would say this. It is to be protected by a power that is efficient and exacting. It is to have men and women whose decisions affect you in private. It is to find that the safety you were offered arrives wrapped in a contract. My life now is safer, yes. People who would have seen me as an easy lever think twice before moving. The factory runs, wages are paid. The town notebooks no longer print the rumors that would have bled us dry. But safety has an appetite. It wants stories. It wants loyalty. It wants names to be useful. It wants you to be the human face of a narrative it can sell. There are nights when I am visited by a memory. The wedding day, the veil slipped, the bracelet on the floor. I ask myself if I would do it the same way again. Would I give Leonardo to Isabella to keep my father's house from burning? Would I sign papers that bind me to a man whose hand I sometimes feel as a knot around my autonomy? I cannot pretend I am blameless. I cannot pretend I had only altruism in my heart. I had survival, fear, and also a fierce protective streak. I made choices that kept people alive and choices that compromised my own independence. I have paid for those choices in quiet ways. When the town gathers for festivals now, people say my name in different tones. There is respect, and there is a whisper of suspicion, and there is a kind of gratitude. I hear it and I accept it. It is not the same as being loved for myself, unburdened by devices. It is being useful, which is another kind of affection. Once, Ricardo sent me a small card on the anniversary of that day at the church. "You did what you had to," it read in his tight handwriting. "We all wear armor in order to survive." I thought about answering with a flourish, with honesty or defiance. Instead, I placed the card in the diary, between pages where I had written about the 999 steps. The diary has become less a private confession and more an archive we occasionally consult. It is less safe now, because safety draws attention. People sometimes ask me, with a guilty curiosity, whether I regret it, the swap, the bargain, the signing of that dark contract that tied me to a man like Ricardo. I tell them the truth. Regret is a tree that grows many kinds of fruit. There are bitter fruits and there are red, heavy ones. I regret the ways we were used. I regret the quiet things that broke. I also do not regret that, in a moment when the house was burning, I chose to do something that kept people from being left with nothing. You ask me for a story that ends in a tidy moral. Life does not offer that. It offers consequences and an accounting that is always overdue. I am untouchable now in the way that a house with a guard dog is untouchable. People are afraid to approach, but the dog barks in the night, and sometimes you sleep less because of that barking. If you push me to a final thought, I will say this. Power can be protection. Power can be a leash. Power can rebuild and also reshape you into someone who must weigh every breath. I walk now with a name attached to me. I have more freedom in the practical sense and less in the poetic. I have a ledger that says people will not get at me easily, but I also have to consider what I owe. I gave my fiancé to my sister. I did it because I thought it would save us. The billionaire made me untouchable. He made me visible and protected in the world of creditors and neighbors. He also bought a claim on my silence and my navigation of the public gaze. He paid with leverage. I paid with autonomy. At night, I sometimes take the bracelet out and hold it up to the light. The little sapphire catches it and throws a blue that is not quite a rose. I trace the silver chain with my thumb and think about the knot of choices I have lived through. I do not know whether the life I have built is the best of possible lives or the least terrible of many. I only know that with protection comes a debt that is not always monetary. It is moral, social, electrical. It hums under your mattress. If you want to know what happened to the people in my life, my father lives with less fear. My mother plants roses.
Isabella has a child who will learn a story that is complicated and messy, like a family tree with roots tangled in old wires. Leonardo is learning new forms of repair that have nothing to do with marriage. And Ricardo continues to be both savior and enforcer, a man whose generosity buys gratitude and whose influence buys loyalty. As for me, I am both shelter and cage. I am both survivor and self-appointed sentinel. I move through the town like an emblem, a woman who made a choice, whose choice saved some and cost others. I think sometimes of the 909 steps and the way choice makes you descend and climb. I think of sacrifices that feel like theft and of theft that feels like salvation. If you stay with the story, you will likely choose a side. People do that because stories are easier to wear than mess. But if you ask me how I sleep now, I will tell you honestly, not often, not as soundly as before. But I sleep with the knowledge that the people under my care are less likely to go hungry. I sleep knowing that power, in the end, is practical. It keeps roofs over heads while rearranging souls. The bracelet sits in my jewelry dish, a small comet I can feel anytime I want to remind myself of who I was and who I have become. It glitters with a blue that is not quite hope and not quite sorrow. I gave my fiancé to my sister, and the billionaire made me untouchable. It was salvation. It was compromise. It was protection with a price. It made my name a shield and my life a negotiation. If you want more stories about people who get caught between love and power, subscribe and follow. There are always more bargains to be told, and every bargain has a ledger.